Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Rector's Forum at All Saints Church. Welcome to everyone who is streaming us. I'm going to turn around and wave at the camera, everybody. Yeah, hello, everybody. It is wonderful to have everybody here. If you're new to All Saints Church, well, then I probably should start by introducing myself. My name is Mike Kinman. I'm the rector here. My pronouns are he, him. And it's great having you here. If you're new here, we'd love to find out more about you. There are green sheets by the doors. You can give us your contact information. Also hang out on the lawn after the forum or after the 11:15 service. It will be great to have you. Just get to know each other around this place. We always put our faith into action here at All Saints Church. Every week we pick one way that we're going to act as a community. Today we're asking everyone to go to our action table on the lawn and sign a letter to your California state senator to put on the ballot in November a constitutional amendment that would restore voting rights to parolees. This is something that is incredibly important. It actually removes one of the last vestiges of Jim Crow laws that were put into the Constitution in the late part of the 19th century. So that's something that if everyone could, when you leave today, go to the action table and do that. Our ministry here at All Saints Church is supported by many, many things. It is supported by the power of the Holy Spirit flowing through this place. It is supported by the incredible presence and activity of everyone who comes into the orbit of All Saints Church. And it's supported by everyone's financial generosity. And so if you have pledged to All Saints Church for 2020, thank you so much. Come on in. Just come on down. And if you haven't, there's still time. We have pledge cards around. Next Sunday is our presentation Sunday. We're going to be celebrating and putting all of our gifts on the table together. You who are streaming got it easy. There's a button right down below where my face is right now, like right here. Just push that and you can donate and you can give and support the ministry and mission of All Saints Church. We were supposed to be four of us here today. And I'll introduce the two who are here. But Jasmine Richards, who is the founder of Black Lives Matter Pasadena, is not able to be with us this morning. And she told me I could share why. And first of all, I want to say Jasmine is going to be okay. She was injured in a drive-by shooting early Friday morning. And she is recovering right now. The bullet seemed to go out of its way not to hit anything that would be critical. And still, she needs our prayers. So I'd actually like us to start by having a moment of prayer for Jasmine. God dwells in you. Let us pray. Most holy and loving God, source of all love, source of all healing power, we lift up to you our sister Jasmine. We ask you to surround her with your love, surround her with your healing energy. We ask you to move through the doctors and nurses and technicians who have charge of her care. We ask you to give them the wisdom and the skill they need to treat her and also bring her to healing in ways that we can't and only you can. We ask you to heal her heart and her mind and her spirit from this deep trauma that she has suffered, a trauma upon trauma. We ask you also to move in the hearts of those who fired upon her. Move them towards your peace and move us all to dismantling the ways that we are together that cause us to lift up arms against each other. Holy God, we ask you to send your holy angels to guard Jasmine and keep her safe. And all this we ask in the name of our brother Jesus. Amen. We are blessed this morning to be joined by two of the more remarkable people I've ever met. And I'm wondering, is this the first time you two have officially met? And so, one of the coolest things I love doing is introducing really cool people to each other.
And I say that I know of because I grew up in Pasadena, so maybe we went to Gymboree together or something. Who knows? So I always say, nice to meet you or see you again, because you never know, or at least I don't.
Yeah. So, Andre Henry he was our preacher and will be our preacher again at 11:15 this morning. He is a poet, musician, activist, podcaster, writer, and proclaimer that it doesn't have to be this way. And Blair and Andre has been here before, and Blair, you've been with us here before, and it's wonderful to have you back. You are an author and an activist, and you have an amazing new book that I've just sort of cracked into, and this is kicking off your book tour. You've got it right there. It's called Making Our Way Home, The Great Migration and the Black American Dream, and copies are for sale. Both of her books, Modern Herstory and this book, are for sale at the table there. Please, please, please pick them up. But we're here to talk, really have a conversation about what does the message, the life, the ministry of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King mean in 2020? Where are we dreaming? Where are we going? And where I really want to start off, I just want to sort of set the stage, kick it off, and then I'm going to let you two sort of run after this. I was doing some reading and recognized that it was 60 years ago tomorrow that Dr. King began his pastorate at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And then 3 months later, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, was founded. And today we talk about the civil rights movement, and the story that we tell when we use that phrase seems to be getting further and further in our rearview mirror. And there's a pattern to change. It goes something like this. There's a movement of intervention that effectively demands progress against oppression, and then there's a backlash, and then continued pressure achieves progress, and then there's a backlash against the progress, and then the system adapts to a new reality, and it finds new ways to continue oppression. And it feels like we've been in that place for a while. And so, Blair, I really want to start with you, because this book is really about the shift that happened with the Great Migration. And I wonder if you could talk about that some, because what we call the civil rights movement really was sort of towards the end of that shift to the Great Migration. So if you could talk about that, and then I'd be interested in your thoughts on what's the shift that's happened since.
Oh, certainly. I will keep it brief because I'm a historian, and if you know any lecturers or professors, we can be long-winded. So for the sake of brevity, essentially, since Reconstruction, there was this, Dr. King has this amazing quote about the moral arc of the universe bending towards justice. But as I like to say, it was people bringing that arc down and bending it with their arms and their full bodies, because that shift was not going to happen on its own, especially in the United States, which was founded on white supremacy. After slavery ended, there was no reparations, there were no job programs, there were no literacy programs. There was the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a short-lived program, but it was not nearly robust enough to accommodate and account for all of the people who had been enslaved and who had been released from bondage, as I like to say, because freed really doesn't consider the fact that they were not free from poverty. They were not free from this cycles of crushing debt that kept them in financial bondage to the people who had possessed them and their bodies just years before. A lot of people and families were still living in the same dwellings while they were sharecropping 50 years on from the end of slavery. So it really, the landscape didn't change very much. But there were still people who were pushing for change. You have, and I talk about it in my book at length, but essentially the civil rights movement, it was much longer. The seeds were planted much earlier. But the way I discuss it in my book, kind of leading up to the 1950s, which is where we're traditionally thought of it happening. Some people say it took place in 1964, which is kind of when we're seeing the fruits. That's very late. I would say that it formally may have started in 1925 when we see the Pullman Porters, the Brotherhood of Pullman Porters being founded by A. Philip Randolph, where you're seeing black folks formally insert themselves into the infrastructure of protections for black Americans. For the black folks here, will you raise your hand if you had a Pullman Porter in your family? One over here. We have some over here, we have some in the back. Yes, and so this is a story that was very familiar to me growing up, people who established the black middle class, people who suffered indignities at work. And for those who don't know, they were essentially servants on rail cars for white folks. And they had a lot of longevity in that industry, because a lot of people who had owned slaves could no longer, and they felt like this big lack, like, oh, I can no longer own slaves, wah. And so they took to the rail cars, and they made these men, they're mostly men, sing for them on command. And so the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was created to protect them against these indignities that they were suffering at the hands of white supremacy. So that just kind of continues on. And it is a continuing movement that was existing whether or not the president was favorable to black liberation, because truly the only president we've had favorable to black liberation, the first one we had was Jimmy Carter, and then we're seeing more progressiveness since then. But somebody who took an outright stance on black people deserve to be resourced equally, that was very rare. And so I say that because we have this present day where we have a very antagonistic administration. And for a lot of my friends who are in the movement, it was kind of this, things are going to get worse, but things will not fundamentally change. We still have the righteousness of spirit. We still have the ability to organize and to create community infrastructure, because that's what we've had to do since Reconstruction. And it's very bleak. It's not to, erase the fact that it does feel like it's gotten worse, because we do have a lot more television. Things have materially gotten worse, but it doesn't mean that our organizing efforts have to stop. And so I would say that the civil rights movement continues because we are constantly working for civil rights. Yes. In many different arenas. And the last thing I will say is that in my book, I made sure to depict Martin Luther King in community with people. So I have this picture of him here, an illustration by Rochelle Baker. It's on page 89 of the book. Hopefully you'll be able to pick one up. And he's speaking to a group of people. And I thought that was very important, because so often Martin Luther King is isolated and turned into this martyr and made to seem like a deity, that we can only touch the hem of his robe, that we can never attain that status. And that was not who he was as a person. I was able to go to Ebenezer Church and listen to the 50th anniversary of his assassination, basically like a recommendation of his funeral. And he was a drum leader for justice, but he was by no means the person who was telling and pulling the strings. And the civil rights movement was by no means a bunch of people in a room like this deciding on one action and going forward. It was many different groups of people working in many different ways. And I think it's important to humanize Dr. King the way that we humanize Jesus, that we talk about how, in the Christian tradition, being the Son of God, and the Muslim tradition, being a great prophet who was close to God, but making sure to understand the fact that this was a human being who walked among us and who did great things, just as we can do great things for justice. And we can all pull that arc of justice, the arc of the universe towards justice. This is something that we can all do. We don't have to be anointed by God, though that is helpful. We can all do it in our own stride.
So you talk about the movement continuing, and a thesis that I started with is that systems adapt to new realities and find new ways to oppress. And they also adapt to tactics of movements, and find new ways to say, okay, that worked last time, that's not going to work this time. So either one of you, where do you see those shifts happening? How has the system of oppression adapted to continue in a new way, and how has it adapted to the tactics of movements, and how are movements responding?
Yeah, I think that it's not common knowledge just how much those who are in favor of racist progress learned from watching the civil rights movement and adopted many of the tactics of the civil rights movement. So what I study is social change and social movements. And as someone who leans more to the left, sometimes I read everything about organizing and activism and social justice as though it belongs on one side of the political spectrum. Then watching the impeachment debates in the House helped me to understand, as I saw Republican representative after Republican representative basically recite the same talking points, I said, oh my gosh, this is people power. And it's one thing that in my opinion, it seems like those who are in favor of racist progress have been a bit, I almost say better at organizing, but the truth is that they
have more resources.
Exactly, that's exactly what I was going to say. Like, they have more resources to dismantle progressive movements and to fund their own movements.
And in my book, I talk about the first black man who was part of the FBI. His name was James Wormley Jr., and all my friends were giggling at the fact that he had worm in his name because he was to infiltrate a group. Worms burrow, there's a little pun in there. But he was only included in the FBI, like the FBI only integrated to dismantle progress within the black community to make sure that Marcus Garvey would get deported. Marcus Garvey, who is a great Pan-Africanist scholar, the originator of Garveyism, this idea that black people deserve a space to call our own in a society that essentially has said, you own nothing, you don't even own yourselves. And so that kind of moment continues into the civil rights movement when literally the only progressive change that was happening in the United States in terms of black community and other communities of color was through community organizing, was through people power. I don't think that can be, you can't put a fine enough point on that fact that it was not a racist institution saying, well, we enslaved these folks, let's give them some rights. It was not that case. It was like changing hearts and minds. It was through campaigns of culture change. It was through music. It was through organizing. It was through sit-ins. It wasn't pleading with people. It was literally taking the hands that were holding on to a supremacist institution and ripping those fingers away so they would let go. And of course, I always like to think of the image being like this, where there's still a little bit held on to that. And every now and again, they try to grab on, and we have to release that finger once more. But it was so frightening to the United States because, as I say in the book, the FBI is essentially an organization to protect the United States government, not necessarily its people. Big point there. And so COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, was created to dismantle these very powerful groups like the NAACP, like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, like the SCLC, like SNCC, like the Black Panther Party. In the case of Fred Hampton, there was a collaboration between the Chicago police and the FBI to literally murder this man because he was seen as so influential to social change. And my Uncle Vernon, who passed recently, he experienced the realities of police brutality. He fled to, was it Jamaica, Dad? To Jamaica. My dad here, and so was my mother. And my manager, Mariel. Yeah, wave, Dad. My Uncle Vernon, when I found out that he was a Black Panther, that's all I wanted to talk to him about. Because as you can tell, the kid that you were becomes the adult that you are. And I love history, always have. I was a little bit less tactful about it. And I'd be like, tell us about what essentially was the most painful part of his life. Yeah. Arguably, the fact that he was harassed and surveilled by the land that he lived and was told to protect and love and did not reciprocate that. And so he had to flee to Jamaica. And I didn't understand at the time, I thought this was such a cool, glamorous part of history with the afros and the amazing magazines, and that's still true, but it was so painful for him, and I talk about that in my book. But essentially, it's this trauma that's happened, and I think I see that in my comrades today. I no longer identify as an activist myself. I feel like I do activist things, but I feel much safer in the label of historian because governments aren't really going after historians the same way. They're going after activists.
They should.
I know they should, but
Yeah.
It'd be great if they didn't, and continue not to. Knock on wood. And I had my own experience with surveillance. I'm a Black American Muslim. I was arrested in Baton Rouge for protesting. Many people would argue that the government is doing its job by keeping tabs on me, but it still had this psychological effect where this paranoia that I think we all have by living in an unsafe country, just like the fear we have of as little kids of getting abducted, transforms into, oh no, there's this real threat that I can't articulate, but I also can't seek refuge from because it is literally our government. I'm in a much better place now, but you have so many activists who are involved in Black Lives Matter who have had the FBI show up to their homes. Yeah. You even have people who are law-abiding citizens being assumed to be part of Black Lives Matter. It's this idea where, oh, if you see 3 Black people together, there's Black Lives Matter, look at them. There they are in action. And so I think there's a lot of pain with it, but I even have to use humor and levity to discuss it for my own mental and emotional health. So it is something that has been this kind of plague of trauma against the Black community, and at the same time, we've been gaslighted by white institutions. So when I talk about having been surveilled, oh, you sounds like you're making that up. Yeah, it does, but only because we're taught to think that that is something delusional when we have a historical record that reveals that no, that's standard operating procedure.
Well, no, and it's in Ferguson, there were drones following activists' cars. And I look at this empty chair right there where Jasmine is, and the truth is the only information we have is that she was shot. Right. We don't know who did it. Right. And the answer of who did it is open to a wide range of possibilities. Yes. for someone who has been as powerful a voice as she has been. Andre, you say you do a lot of work in social movements, and it's good definitely good to remember that the civil rights movement was not this short period of time. It built up over a long period of time, and so the quote you used from Dr. King this morning used the word persistent agitation, and that's incredibly important. And at the same time, from my perspective, I look at what we are trying to do, what freedom fighters are trying to do, and it feels like it just keeps running up against a brick wall, and that the system has adapted to the means of protest. You preached, and if you haven't heard this yet, just buckle your seatbelts and wait for 11:15. But you did preach about we need, as always, have needed a spectacular intervention. Yes. How do you see the movement today? What would a spectacular intervention look like?
Yeah, that is kind of the question that drives my life. And every time I think I know what it is. No, I don't, But here's what I can say. The things that stand out to me in reading so many people who have been involved in social movements and talking with people. I've been fortunate to have people that I call mentors who have started international movements and toppled dictators in other countries and things like that. And so in those conversations, there are some common themes. One is organization, is that you just cannot underestimate the value and the need to have organized resistance. Most people that I talk to outside of kind of activist circles believe a lot of myths about social change. Like, we believe that the revolution will be incremental and incidental, when really we need to move entire social blocks into sustained resistance. What we don't understand is that principle of people power, that power in society does not rest in the hands of certain individuals, that the game only works if we all play it. That's how that works. We don't know that we don't know about the study from hi. Sorry, I saw Cheryl and she's dear to me. We don't know about the study of over 300 conflict situations all over the world from Erica Chenowith and Maria J. Stephan that says that no regime has been able to withstand the sustained resistance of 3.5% of the population. 3.5%. Now, when I talk to black people about liberation, a lot of us say, well, there's not enough of us. It takes 3.5%. And we make up 13%.
The way I like to articulate this, because I talk about that study often, is just imagine how many people it takes to mess up the subway system in New York. I know we're in California, we're not in New York. It literally takes one person to ruin your entire schedule. Yeah. That's it. Or
Very
somebody
true.
Walking slowly across an intersection. How fast does traffic build up on the 101, y'all? How fast does it build up on the 210? It takes one person who doesn't know how to merge. That's it. So imagine that as a system. All it takes is a couple people with good intentions and a good strategy to really mess up the train or the traffic of white supremacy.
Yes. So Dr. King talks a lot about militant nonviolence. And this is the part that gets erased from what he's talking about a lot. He, over and over again, in the I Have a Dream speech, his most famous speech, he talks about the civil rights movement as a marvelous new militarism. And it's completely erased. And he keeps talking this way throughout his life. Well, in the field of nonviolence, they talk about nonviolent struggle as war without weapons. And they incorporate these different kind of appropriating what would it look like to be a nonviolent force but be so militantly. So we already talked about organization. That's one of those things. Another part is, though, taking the initiative. We need a movement that is not always reacting to whatever the bad news is. And so we hear, this person got shot by the police in the neighborhood, and then we spring into action. Or Donald Trump tried to pass this law, and then we spring into action. There's something to people getting together, examining a problem, and asking, in what way does this problem depend on the mass cooperation of the American people? What are the pillars of support to this problem? And then to think about how, if we can answer that question, how does that pillar, or how do these pillars depend on the mass cooperation of the people? Then we can start thinking about, well, how do we withdraw support from that? An example. One of the movements that I find inspiring right now is called Extinction Rebellion, and they're doing work around global warming. And so here's, we know that the fossil fuel industry is the biggest contributor to global warming. I know that people are trying to tell you that you can recycle enough to save the world. You cannot. Yeah. I know that people want to tell you that if we all just stop eating meat, that will save the world. That will not help. It's helpful, but the biggest contributor to global warming is the fossil fuel industry. We have to dismantle the fossil fuel industry. Okay, pillars of support to the fossil fuel industry. Banking institutions. Chase Bank, Wells Fargo, Citibank, and there was one more that I can't remember, but Chase is the biggest contributor, right? So there's a pillar of support. Do banks depend on the mass participation of the American people?
That's right.
Who here has a bank account? Look at that. So the way that you remove that pillar is by making people aware, did you know that your bank is the biggest contributor to the fossil fuel industry, which is literally why Australia and parts of Africa and the Amazon are on fire? You make people aware, and you try to organize a withdrawal of that support. I think that the movement moving forward, and it's always hard to say the movement because the movement has so many different, like Blair said, like the civil rights movement was not just Dr. King and the SCLC, it was the NAACP and CORE and SNCC and all them together. But whatever it is, that movements have to work together. We have to be strategic. We have to take the initiative. Those are things I think are for sure.
And you were talking about kind of demystifying this whitewashed narrative of Martin Luther King. I'd really love to read you all Dr. King's speech about Beyond Vietnam, and we're at a time of war, this perpetual war. Some of us who are younger than me, I'm 26 years old, but for folks who are 20 years old, 18 years old, you've been at war your entire life. You have soldiers who are serving in the Middle East who were not alive when 9/11 happened, this perpetual war. So I'd love to read this speech by Dr. King. One moment. All right. In 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King made an appeal to end the American investment in waging war abroad in Vietnam and in the destabilization of governments in South America. He delivered a speech titled Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence, on April 4th, 1967, at Riverside Church in New York City. This speech combined with sorry. I'm not a great reader out loud, but I still wrote a book, so be encouraged to follow your dreams. I say that to students all the time, and they're like, wow, I can do it too. And I'm like, yeah, it's fine. All right. This speech, combined with SNCC's increased advocacy against the draft, distinguished the war in Vietnam as one of the most opposed by the Black community. Dr. King said, "A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. With righteous indignation, it will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West investing large sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of the countries. And it will say, this is not just. It will look at our alliance with the landed gentry of South America and say, this is not just. The Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. A true revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and say of the war, this way of settling differences is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of peoples normally humane, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields, physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Exactly 1 year after delivering that speech, an assassin murdered Dr. King in Memphis, Tennessee. And less than a month later, Coretta Scott King gave a speech in Central Park about ending the war in Vietnam because her work was not yet done. And I think that meditating on that fact that Dr. King was fundamentally anti-war, anti-poverty, anti-white supremacy, anti-racist, looking at him as a whole person with flaws, with amazing talents, will get us closer to justice because we can truly understand that it takes all of us, that everyone needs to play the game, and maybe we can even get it up to 5% of participants changing the social order. Right in that same chapter, I talk about the different movements that took place during the 1960s for disability rights. There were Black Panthers, there was women's liberation, there was LGBT liberation, there was the indigenous rights movement with the occupation of Alcatraz that some of y'all might remember. To really get rid of this idea of incrementalism, that we can all fight injustice, period. Yeah. And it's not a matter of who's suffering more, although that should be honored and recognized, who's suffering less, although that should be accounted for privilege and who has more ability to fight for longer. It should really be a discussion of how can we do the most good and the least harm.
Amen. Yeah. So I want to we got a few minutes left. I'd love to talk about the church and what our role has been in this and what our role can be in this. And it struck me as I was listening to, we use the readings that we use today are assigned to the feast of the birth of Dr. King. And the gospel chosen for this day is the turn the other cheek gospel. And you know, in remembering sort of who put together the lectionary, it was definitely a group of white men who put that together. And I thought about how we as the church, even as we are observing Dr. King, the gospel reading we choose, we could have chosen Jesus going into the temple with the whip of cords. Right. Yeah. There's a lot of things we could have choose, and instead we chose what many Christians, I don't think this is what Jesus meant by this, was just be nice to each other. Don't do anything, we chose something that could be really used against activists who are protesting. And so, you talk about I'd love to hear sort of your thoughts about the church's role historically in this, because I think that's also been mythologized. And also, what's the church's role now, and what should the church's role be?
I think so. I used to be Christian, and for a long time I was a very disgruntled former Christian who was resentful of the way that white supremacy worked through the church. And it wasn't until I went to a lecture by Reverend Jackie Lewis in New York at Middle Church, where I started to understand that even if a historical text, religious or otherwise, has been used to oppress people, humans are so intelligent and so exceptional in the way that we can find liberation absolutely anywhere, even if it seems that it's impossible. And I know this is fact because the way that I read Star Trek and watch Star Trek, I will find some proverbs from there. Any Trekkies in the house? What's up? Yeah. You can find some real stories in there, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a religious text where you find your inspiration. But I thought about the King James Bible and how it was intentionally written at the Council of Trent by King James in 1500 or 1502 to remove and to glorify monarchs and to remove the people power, to remove messages from the text that could be used by the serfs and by the folks who were gaining literacy during that time to feel empowered. And yet, black people were given that text when we were converted to Christianity during enslavement, and we still found strength within this sanitized text because the human spirit is absolutely impossible to stamp out, especially when we were in community with one another. So I think about the historical historical context. And I also think about how following enslavement during Reconstruction, the church was a place of immense strength for people. It was a place where people learned literacy, where people learned public speaking. I learned public speaking in church from Pastor Epps at Second Baptist. He would stand up and down, and he would really get into the motion where he basically taught me that you can have your monologue kind of written down, your bullet points, but at the end of the day, if you catch the spirit, you have to go full forward into it. You have to feel that. You have to be present with the people, and that's a public speaking tool that I'm constantly telling my friends who also do public speaking. And while I'm not Christian any longer, I still carry a lot of that call and response tradition from the Black church, a lot of that hymnal tradition. I love quoting the Quran, but I also love praying for people when they're being ridiculous. I'll be like, well, I'm gonna pray for you. And that shade is also from the Black church. And so that really makes me think of how church can be a place of strength, but it can also be a place of hurt. I grew up fortunate where I never was in a place where the preacher in a pulpit was saying things that were homophobic, that were anti-Black, that were against women. I never had that, and I think my parents did an excellent job making sure I wasn't around that. But I still think of the ways that church can bring community together, and I think All Saints is really doing an exemplary job. I told the last time I came to speak here that this was the first church I had gone to since like Prop 8 was being decided on, and All Saints was very outspoken about the fact that yes, we will do weddings here for gay couples, whether they are in a civil union or otherwise, whether they want to renew their vows or just be in community and have a wedding ceremony, whether or not the United States government will recognize that as a marriage. And it really taught me that whether or not other churches are doing it does not mean that you cannot follow what is righteous in your heart. And I think that's just really powerful. In Episcopal churches, I've spoken in Episcopal church like this past week, and I would think I was first baptized Episcopal, right? At St. Mark's? Yeah. And so I'm like fact-checking with my parents because they're here. And so I think that church can come to our lives, but being a Muslim, however we're able to get close to God in community is something beautiful and something to be revered. But yeah, it took me a long time to get to that point where I was able to be in a church again after converting.
Yeah, Andre.
Well, we know, and I don't want to spend too much time on the first tradition because we know the white supremacist tradition of the church, and we can all talk about, from, even the 1400s, the Pope writing, a papal bull that gives the colonizers permission, as though he had the authority, to, enter lands and enslave and to kill and all that kind of stuff. We can trace that down to white evangelicals in the civil rights movement, who were some of the leading, members of the Ku Klux Klan. By the way, I grew up in Stone Mountain, which is where the second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan was founded, was in my city. And I lived next door to a Klansman that was the pastor of the street, pastor of the church up the street. So, that history is there, and we're aware of that history. I think the history that we're less aware of is, for instance, my roots go back to Jamaica. The Baptist church in Jamaica was always revolutionary. It was more Africanized than, some versions of Christianity that existed in America. One of my favorite stories is how my ancestors would sit there and listen to the Christian missionaries, and the Christian missionaries were never very popular in Jamaica because they preached white supremacy. And so after they would have these sessions with the missionaries, they'd say, you talk really fast and you have like a strong accent, like, we're just gonna stay here and talk about your sermon. And the missionary would leave and they would plan revolutions. And so these pastors were leading like these insurrections, these slave rebellions, all these kind of things. And those are the stories that we don't know as well, and I wish that we did. To that point, in social movement studies, social movement theory, there's one school of thought called resource mobilization theory. And the idea behind resource mobilization is that social movements happen and that they succeed by us combining our resources. The reason why the Black colleges and Black churches were at the vanguard of the civil rights movement is because these were some of the only institutions where they had Black leadership. They didn't have to answer to white leadership, and so it was Black money that funded many of these institutions. And think about the institutions that exist, the resources that exist within these institutions. Buildings, land, communication networks, leaders already. You already had people who knew Dr. King because he was a local pastor, then he becomes the president of the SCLC. So they talk about how movements begin with like indigenous resources, the things that exist already in the mass base. And when the movement kicks off, then the movement appropriates the resources of the already existing institutions. That is the role that, and we don't talk about the role of the church in that way very much, and how that's why the church, the black church, was able to contribute the way that it did to the civil rights movement. And that's what I look at churches today and say, you still have resources. Look at all these people in this room that come, that come every Sunday and say, I'm just trying to figure out how to be a better person. I'm trying to figure out how I can love people and live better. That's a resource that churches have. All the land, the buildings, the money, those things can be organized into a way that can really make a difference in the world.
Yes, thank you. And we got like a minute or two left. I'd like to give each of you a chance. What is a final word you'd like to leave us with?
I think that the final thing I'd like to leave y'all with the Martin Luther King Jr. weekend and week, honestly, is that Black history doesn't just happen in snapshot moments. And to think, so many of us think, well, what would I have done during the civil rights movement? I know I do all the time. I'm like, I would have been Angela Davis for sure. But again, my version of her, not necessarily her. And I think that we can get so caught up in that fictionalized role play and this idealized version of what would I do in that situation, that we forget, I'm currently living in a time of immense movement making, where there are children who are being detained at the border, who are being disappeared, where there's an impeachment process, where there's this war going on in Iran, and there's Black Lives Matter still taking place. So to think, not what would I have done, but what am I presently doing? And I always think of this phrase, what am I doing today to make tomorrow better? And I think that that's really important because there is these discussions of incrementalism, but I'm really dedicated to this idea of what can I do today to make somebody's tomorrow better, because while that might seem incremental, it's really a revolutionary thought that how can I disrupt a system, how can I divest from a system to make sure that I'm doing more good than I am harm? And then the last thing, I said recently in this this interview I did about activism, and it was a very candid one with M.M. LaFleur, and when I get candid, it's always fun. And so I said, think of activism like a potluck. If you have no dairy in your home, don't bring the mac and cheese. And if somebody's been making mac and cheese for 10 years, have them make the mac and cheese, and you figure out if you need to bring a salad or something else, and really think of it that way. What resources do I presently have in my refrigerator of social justice to contribute to this potluck? To really think, well, maybe I'm a high-up person at Chase Bank. Maybe I should speak to my higher-ups. Maybe I should organize a letter-writing campaign within my institution. Not to necessarily think, I'm in PR, I'm going to quit my life and I'm going to go be an activist in the streets, but how can I use my current sphere of influence towards justice so that we are all being those hands pulling the moral arc of the universe towards justice, because we can do that in our everyday lives.
Anytime someone says, is there something you want to leave with people? I mean, if you know me, you know what I'm going to say. It doesn't have to be this way.
That's right.
You know I'm going to say that. Mm-hmm. And when I say that it doesn't have to be this way, I don't think people really understand that I'm talking about, and I'm going to spend, I don't know how long I preached last sermon, but I'm going to spend several minutes unpacking this, is that we have what we need to create the change that we need to see in the world. The question is not about our capability or our ability. This is a matter of our will. This is a matter of our desire, Are we willing to do it? I said before on these grounds, and I'll say it again, that history is not a story that is happening to us. It's one that we are writing together. The fact of the matter is that all these problems that we see in the world, again, they depend on the participation of so many people. And if our obedience is the thing that's holding up those systems, then our defiance is the thing that can change that. We know this intrinsically because when we talk about the great atrocities of history, when we talk about things like the Holocaust and things like that, we always say, what were all those ordinary people doing? Which means that we understand that our passivity is still writing history. That's our power. That if we say, I don't matter. If I don't contribute anything, like it's not. No, we know that even standing on the sidelines, remaining a third party, is still writing history. So we know that. So the thing that we need to do is realize that we can actually make a difference on this. If we can imagine a new future together and we can organize ourselves, we can have a different world.
Amen. Blair Imani, Andre Henry, thank you so much.